One of the great imbalances of life, the kind of thing that Solomon in Ecclesiastes would call vanity or vapor, is when people reject and even attack the very people who are trying to help them in some way. Law enforcement officers and military personnel are slandered and sometimes even physically attacked by the very people that they're trying to protect and defend. It happens in this country, it happens all over the world. It's a vanity of human nature. Parents who try to help a child overcome a self-destructive habit are hit with hate-filled verbal abuse by the child that they're trying to save. The same thing often happens with teachers and school administrators and medical personnel. Sometimes it happens when a spouse tries to correct the other one's behavior because they see that it's self-damaging in some way. And instead of seeing the good in that effort, the self-damaging spouse fights back with insensitive or nasty words. And like the prophets of old, like the prophets of the Old Testament, a preacher who delivers a hard truth is often run out of town on a rail because he was willing to speak the truth. He was willing to tell a hard message to those who needed to hear it. He spoke on behalf of God, trying to help somebody, and yet he was attacked by the very people that he was trying to help. Like a dog that bites the hand of those who feed it, humans have a tendency to turn against the very ones who have the greatest ability to help us. It is one of life's ugliest vanities, a grave evil under the sun. So why, with that possibility then, do people continue to try to do good for others? Why is it that when somebody could fight back against you, they could reject you in such an awful kind of way, what would motivate you to still do good for them? Ultimately, it's humility. Having the humility to still be there and still be a servant to that person, even when they refuse to accept it. Jesus, above all others, knew what that was like. He knew what it was like to be the one who was hated by the very people he came to help. And he demonstrated the most powerful kind of humility toward them, especially at the very end. Do you have a Bible this morning? Would you open it to Matthew chapter 26? If you're using one of the Bibles from our pews, you can find that on page 782. Matthew chapter 26, we find Jesus submitting to the hatefulness of mankind, to their evil rejection of him in all of its ugliness. A man who was simply described as one who went about doing good. And yet this is how they treat him, starting in verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now Judas, the betrayer, had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest to cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures from the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled, and those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And from there the rest of the night is filled with false witnesses at his trial, with being thrown into the court of Herod and then in Pilate's presence and over again berated for his behavior, which was purely good, but he was falsely accused. He was insulted and taunted by the priest, by the high priest, by the council. He is rejected. They are biting the hand that feeds them over and over again through this night. Judas is, of course, the worst offender. Friend, Jesus calls him. And yet he turns his back on Jesus and he hates him and he does this violence to him. So what's Jesus' motivation? What do we learn from him? Why did he go through with it? Why didn't he just call the 12 legions of angels and wipe them all out? Send a plague of their worst fears on these people as payment for what they've done to him. He doesn't do it because he's too humble for that. That's what love is, brothers and sisters. Love is the humility to care entirely about another person, even if that other person hates you. And it was so complete in Jesus' case that he submitted to their will above his own. In mankind's darkest hour, we have the brightest, shining example of humility that has ever been seen. It's no wonder that Jesus felt like he had the credibility to say, when someone strikes you on the cheek, have the humility to turn the other one toward him. Let him do that one too. He did that. He did exactly what he is asking us to do. He had the humility to continue to love and serve them to the very end, even while they rejected and attacked him. And that's the Jesus that we remember in communion. The man who was despised, rejected, stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, who was silent before his attackers like a little gentle lamb is silent before those that shear its wool. And he opened not his mouth before his enemies. He didn't call 12 legions of angels to wipe them out. He submitted to them. Surely there has never been a truer level of humility contrasted with a worse example of human pride. May Jesus teach us today how far humility ought to take us. That even if it's to those we are trying to help, those who reject us and hate us for our efforts, we have the humility to stay faithful to God and loving toward that person, to be a servant to them. I hope that communion reminds us today to be thankful to God for the silent lamb who submitted to his captors and became the redeemer that we needed even after we rejected him. One of the most memorable teachings and one of the most difficult teachings that Jesus ever spoke was love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Do we have the humility like he did to actually do that? The cross reminds us that he meant that when he said it, that he was the example to follow. And I hope that communion today challenges us. Can we actually do that as well? Can we eat the bread and drink the cup and remember the meekness that motivated him, so that it motivates us to serve God and serve others in the same way?